Hi there, welcome to Cybersecurity Dojo. My name is Dave, and today we're talking about the principle of least privilege. This is one of those cybersecurity topics that, when done right, can seriously reduce risk and help stop attackers in their tracks. In this video, we'll be covering what the principle of least privilege is, how it applies to cybersecurity, common challenges, and how to get it right. With that being said, let's jump right in. So what is the principle of least privilege? It's the idea that users, systems, and applications should only have the minimum access necessary to do their job, and nothing more. This means no extra permissions, no unnecessary admin rights, and no broad access just in case. The goal here is simple: limit access to limit risk. It's also a smart move because if a user account gets compromised and that account only has access to a few files or systems, the damage is limited. But if that same account has access to everything, now you've got a much bigger problem. This principle doesn't just apply to people. It also applies to things like scripts, services, and application programming interfaces, or APIs for short. Anything that accesses a system should only be given the permissions that it needs and nothing beyond that. So how does the principle of least privilege actually help in cybersecurity? It comes down to something called the attack surface, which is basically the total number of ways an attacker can potentially get into a system and move around inside it. The more permissions a user or system has, the more damage an attacker can do if that account gets compromised. And you can shrink that attack surface by applying the principle of least privilege. For example, if an attacker gains access to a regular user account that only has access to a shared folder, their options are limited. But if that same account has unnecessary access to system settings, sensitive databases, or confidential files, it's game over. The principle of least privilege also helps reduce the risk of accidental changes or data exposure. Sometimes, the biggest problems aren't caused by malicious actors. They're caused by well-meaning users with too much access. So whether you're defending against external threats or preventing internal mistakes, the principle of least privilege is a simple but effective way to help minimize risk and contain impact. Now, the principle of least privilege sounds simple, but in practice, it can be a real challenge to manage. And one of the biggest issues that organizations face is something called privilege creep. This happens when users gradually accumulate more access over time. Maybe they switch teams, or perhaps they get temporary permissions for a project, or they just never lose access after a role change. And before long, someone who only needs access to a handful of systems has permissions to way more than they should, and nobody notices until there's a problem. And when something does go wrong, it becomes hard to trace who did what, or even whether access was legitimate. I actually talked about this in a previous video on authenticity and non-repudiation, which breaks down how we verify identities and ensure users can't deny their actions. And if you haven't seen that yet, I'll link it down in the description of this video if you'd like to check that out. Another challenge is that least privilege can be hard to enforce without the right tools or processes. If you're not regularly reviewing access rights, auditing permissions, or tracking role changes, it's easy for excessive permissions to slip through the cracks. And in fast-paced environments, it's tempting to just give users more access than they need for convenience purposes, which creates risk that builds up over time. In fact, I've personally had requests to give brand new employees the same level of permissions as someone who's been slowly accumulating permissions through role changes that were never revoked. And that's exactly how privilege creep happens. It's also important to consider service accounts and automated processes. These are often overlooked but can hold excessive permissions that attackers love to exploit, especially if they're using default credentials or shared passwords. Implementing least privilege requires an ongoing effort. It's not just a one-time setup. It means continuously asking, does this user or system still need this access? And if the answer is no, it needs to be revoked. Now you might be thinking, Dave, that sounds like a lot of work. And you'd be correct. That's why in larger organizations, it's very common for entire teams to handle permissions and account creation and terminations. The principle of least privilege is one of the simplest and most effective concepts in cybersecurity. By limiting access to only what's necessary, you reduce risk, shrink your attack surface, and make it easier to detect and contain security incidents when they happen. It's not always easy to implement, especially in larger organizations, but the long-term benefits are worth it. My advice? Start small, review existing permissions, set up regular access audits, and be sure to question broad or inherited access rights. And remember, least privilege isn't just about prevention, it's also about control, visibility, and accountability. If you found this video helpful, let me know by hitting the like button. Drop a comment below if you have any questions or if you've run into privilege creep in your own environment. And if you haven't already, please consider hitting the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.